Hello, everyone, and today we're going to kind of finish our notes here on Australia and Oceania by talking first about an area of the world called Polynesia. And Polynesia, despite not having a huge land mass, actually represents a pretty massive area of the surface of the world. You can kind of think of Polynesia as like a triangle out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The northern point of the triangle being actually the islands of Hawaii, that is part of the United States. So yes, part of the United States actually is part of Polynesia. The southwest, or bottom left corner of the triangle is New Zealand. So just think about how far it is from Hawaii to New Zealand, and you get an idea of how big a span we're talking about. And then the eastern, or bottom right corner of the triangle is Easter Island, out there in the eastern Pacific Ocean, off the coast of South America. And so that big triangle and all the many islands that are in the middle there, and you can see some of them, I think, Tuvalu, Samoa, the Cook Islands, an island called Society Island, of all things, a place you may have heard of called Bora Bora, which is a popular vacation spot. All of those areas are considered to be part of Polynesia. And so when I tell you about the Polynesian people, which is going to be here on the next slide, keep in mind how large an area this is and how many, storms and hurricanes and stuff go through here. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is an area with a lot of volcanic activity. We talked about atolls a couple of days ago and how these are islands built up on reefs. The other way that you get land out here in the Pacific Ocean is from volcanoes. Volcanoes spew out lava into the ocean, and eventually the lava, of course, hardens, cools into rock, which builds up until eventually it emerges above the sea level, and you have a new island. And so that some of these islands are atolls, and some of these islands are volcanic islands, and pretty much that's it. The only New Zealand is kind of the exception to that, being basically kind of a little part of a continent. Not really, but it's not a particularly volcanic area. Unlike Hawaii, for example, which I think most of you know, it is very volcanic. There's several volcanoes out in Hawaii. Polynesia, for the last 3,000 to 4,000 years, and this is one of the last areas in the world that humans actually reached. For a long time, even while humans were in Africa and Asia and Europe, and even North and South America, there were not human beings in Polynesia. Polynesian peoples are the descendants of the first humans to explore the Pacific Islands. This is about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So you can think about 1,000 to 2,000 BCE. How did they get out there? Well, they used these small boats that have outriggers, or we might call them pontoons. And these boats, while they're not very big, because they have these outriggers, they're very stable. So even if you get a heavy wind or a big wave, you're not going to tip the boat over, what's called capsizing. You're going to be able to stay level. And so that allowed that, even though these are small boats, they could traverse wide open ocean spaces. Polynesian peoples do not have an indigenous writing system. They did not develop writing, but they did develop cartography or map making. And they developed these maps that are basically sticks and seashells to actually plot the stars. And they had an understanding of star movements and how to navigate using the stars, which I think you'd agree is pretty remarkable and advanced. And using these little outrigger boats and these stick and seashell maps, they were able to navigate between different islands. In many cases, you could kind of think of these as like seafaring hunter-gatherers. Polynesian peoples practice some agriculture, but volcanic islands are marginal spaces for agriculture, partly because the soil tends to be pretty poor. If you're going to have good soil, you want it to be really rich in organic things like rotted old plants and animals. Well, a lot of these islands are not that old either, right? They just came out of the ocean when the volcano erupted. So the soil in these places tends to be very rocky, not good for agriculture. They also tend to suffer from a lack of fresh water. There's not going to be big rivers or freshwater lakes in these places, everything is going to be salty because they're right next to the ocean. You're not going to get the rivers fed by mountain runoff like you do in a big continent like Asia. And so in terms of fresh water, they're pretty dependent on rain. And, rain, while not necessarily uncommon, isn't always very predictable. And so Polynesian peoples, to get food and to supply themselves, would usually rely on fishing, and they'd rely on tree fruits and nuts. You could think of coconuts as being a good example. And so Polynesian peoples would oftentimes move from island to island, kind of following fish and following where, good fruits and nuts could be gathered, as they kind of exhausted the supplies that they might have on the island that they were on. And if you're thinking, this sounds like a movie that I've watched, if you've seen the movie Moana, and obviously with a Disney movie, you're going to get some truths and some half-truths and some things that are not very true at all, but they're definitely, that was a depiction of Polynesian people, and so it's kind of a sketch of, how did Polynesian people live, what was their lifestyle, what were some of their cultural beliefs. Yeah, you can use Moana as kind of a rough guide to that. I have a couple of pictures here. On the left is a traditional Polynesian boat, and you see it's got that base, that flat part, obviously, where you would stand and operate the ship from, but then it's got the two things on its either side. And so, it'll tip, but it won't tip all the way over. And then on the right here, you have one of these sticks and seashell maps. And, you're going to say, okay, what does that mean? And I have no idea. But if I asked a, Polynesian from 2,000 years ago, he'd be like, oh, yeah, I follow this star, and then I go to this star, and then I go to my uncle's island. So, yeah, pretty remarkable stuff. I do want to talk just a little bit more about the Aborigines. I know we talked a lot about them yesterday. Of course, the Aborigines, the original people of Australia, they tended to live in small family units. They were hunter-gatherers. So we have some evidence that they did do some level of agriculture, but primarily hunter-gatherers. They had strong religious beliefs based on nature, I think, as you saw from the videos yesterday. And then the Maori. The Maori are the native people of New Zealand. The Maori are different. They lived in villages. They tended to live in bigger groups. They were both hunted, but they also farmed. They tended to have fairly intense conflicts with other Maori tribes within New Zealand. And also in the Maori culture, oral storytelling is a big thing, one of their big beliefs. The Maori are actually descendants of Polynesian peoples, and so they're kind of an offshoot, but they're kind of part of the extended family of Polynesian people. And I think there's one of the traditional stories of Maori is that they're the descendants of this clan of Polynesians that got washed away on a storm and got lost and then wound up in New Zealand, and that's not where the Maori came from. To this day, Maori culture is still a big thing, even though most people from New Zealand today are of European descent, are white. There's still an appreciation for Maori culture there, and I think in general you'd have to say that modern New Zealand has a better record of respecting the culture of their indigenous people than Australia does. When we're talking about the Aborigines, I think you probably saw this in the video, but I'm not sure if they said it explicitly. They're the originators of the didgeridoo, that has kind of that low kind of hum sound to it. And they are actually the originators of the boomerang, the curved stick you can throw and it'll come back to you. That is the Aboriginal Australians developed that. So, it goes to show, even though you're a hunter-gatherer, doesn't mean that you stop inventing stuff. And the Aborigines gave us two pretty remarkable little inventions there. As we saw yesterday, the Aborigines, unfortunately, many were killed in confrontations and wars with British colonists. The thing about the stolen generation, which is just absolutely tragic. Kidnapped basically from their homes, forced to adopt Western custom and dress, convert to Christianity, and then, of course, married off to try to breed out the bloodline, which is just a weird idea, but is something that they did up until the 1900s. And even today, Aboriginal peoples still face poverty and discrimination in Australia. And I think, if you can think of the experience of Aboriginal people in Australia as largely similar to the experience of Native peoples here in the United States, and that, there's still kind of this legacy of discrimination, unfortunately. Some other events in Australian history, and obviously this is an extremely broad overview. Australia became a possession of the British Empire after it was scouted by James Cook in the 1770s. Of course, it's pretty far away from Britain and everything else, so the British government decided, well, this is a good place to put all the people we don't want to see again. And so it was used as a penal colony, or basically it was a place to send prisoners, the people that were going to serve long prison sentences. They said, hey, you can go serve it in Australia. We don't have to worry about seeing you again back in London. And this practice didn't last that long. By the middle of the 1800s, this was really not happening anymore. But there's still kind of this, cultural idea that Australians are, all the descendants of crooks. And I think Australians today are sensitive to this. And, if you say, oh, well, you guys are just a bunch of, descendants of crooks, it is offensive to Australians to suggest that, and is not true for the vast majority of Australians today. Australia fought as an ally of the United States in both World War I and World War II, and has been a strong ally of the United States. And there are certainly many kind of cultural connections and similarities. I think both Australians and Americans are very athletic minded. We like our sports. We like our outdoors. I think both Australians and Americans tend to be very individualistic. We want to do what we want to do. And I think Australians and Americans tend to like each other. I think that there's a lot of kind of cross-cultural connections between these two countries. Obviously, Australia, a much smaller population. But I think a country with kind of a cultural cachet, perhaps larger than its population would indicate. Australia today is a modern, it's an extremely wealthy economy. Australia has extensive mineral resources that they're exporting to countries like China and other manufacturing powers in Southeast Asia there. And so, that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on in Australia. And is that it? That is it. All right, so that is it. You're going to fill out the note sheet I gave you for today based on what you have here. And then on Monday, we're going to start off, and there's going to be a little quiz just on some of this stuff, not only, the geography of Australia and Oceania, the people, the Aborigines, the Maori, the Polynesians, a little Australian history, and then, of course, the actual geography itself, the countries. You got to know Australia, New Guinea, New Zealand. You've got to know those cities and states and territories in Australia. And, again, these quizzes don't really count for a grade, but they are a way for us to just kind of see where you are to make sure that you're learning this, and you get some feedback too. So we'll do that on Monday before we move on to our ancient history stuff. But I hope you enjoyed this last little thing for Australia and Oceania, and I hope you guys have a great weekend.